Good.
Crazy times we're living in.
Yeah, they are.
You know, so yeah, it's
I know,
it's
because it
hard
was
to know
like
where to begin,
it was
right?
just crazy, and
Uh,
then Ruth Bader Ginsburg's like, "Oh, now we're gonna have this fight," and then Trump gets COVID. It's like, oh, it's like, and we're still weeks away from this election, and it's like, oh, whatever happens, may it
I
not be close. I
think
mean, may it not be hanging chads. I don't know if, as a society, we can handle that level of.
yeah,
Ugh. So
I
yeah,
I don't know either, and that's why I reached out, right? Is seems like we're in for 31 different October surprises because it seems like each day of October is just delivering us a new bombshell.
yeah,
And that Politico report that came out, I think on the 1st, that trend line worries me a lot.
yeah.
That since 2017, I think, was when the polling started, the number of respondents who said it was okay, at least a little bit, if their side engaged in political violence to achieve their ends, went from 8% across both parties to now 33 and 36%
Yeah.
for each party. And I would hope that that is heavily balanced towards you know the minimum viable justification, or I guess the maximum viable justification, in that, like, oh, I could see a world where I might be driven to this, right? They're not necessarily, most people probably still aren't ready to jump out of their seats, but the fact that that trend line is increasing and that we've seen political violence this year already,
Yeah.
um, has me very, very worried. So I reached out to you, and I want to be mindful of the fact, I'm the guest here.
Yeah, go
This is
right
this
ahead.
is your house. Since but I figured since I could kick us off with that Politico report, and um, in our first conversation, we came to the agreement of uh, you know working terms that talking is better than hitting, and then we got into some really interesting sort of numinous style conversations about metaphysics and what that means psychologically and sociologically, which is all very fascinating. But in the intervening couple of weeks, I'm now finding myself trying to think very, very concretely about what can we do right now, today, tomorrow, the next day, over the course of the next 4 weeks up to election day, and then regardless of the results of the presidential election, what can we do between then and inauguration day, and what can we do moving forward to try and get that percentage of people who are ready to engage in political violence? What can we do to flatten that curve?
Right.
Because I see that as being catastrophic on a much shorter time scale than I would have hoped. Like we talked last time about the difference in the Protestant Reformation, C.S. Lewis's complaint that it should have been handled by good friends over pipe smoke in the study, but instead it happened in the battlefield.
Yeah.
And to whatever extent we can preempt that sort of um, unrest here in the States, I want to do it. And you seemed like a good person to talk to brainstorm, what we can all do as individuals, and maybe if you know of any larger scale efforts, or who's doing good work in this space that you've seen.
Yeah.
Figured you might have some input there.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the places to begin, I think you asked the question well. When we say concretely, there's a big difference between I and we. Because concretely, what can I do? I have a degree of agency and control over what I do. A lot of what if we, let's say someone like Jonathan Haidt's premise that I agree with, that part of why we are where we are now is due to the rise of social media. When I look at how people use Facebook or Twitter, because those are the two platforms that I'm on, they're asking, a lot of people are asking, how can we blank? And that might mean, how can we reelect Donald Trump, or how can we avoid reelection? How can we? And so I think a lot of this, the difference between the I and the we has to get into creating a context where we respect the agency of other people, because I think you and I should ask the question, at what point do people give up talking and start hitting, or worse? Because that's, I mean, so if we begin with that political argument, or that political piece about people just thinking out loud about the justification for violence, I think it's really helpful to ask, where is that line in people's lives? You know, what, and this sounds, I mean, people, we don't talk this way in public, in polite society very often, but you might ask yourself, if you're married or if you're living with someone, at what point would you hit your spouse? At what point is it, would you find it justifiable to hit your spouse? Now, I think a lot of people would say it's never justifiable. That's what they would say. That lots of people who say it's never justifiable probably still do it. And so when it gets into this question of, well, what can I do? Well, one of the things that I can do is, for example, adopt a personal ethic of nonviolence, let's say. And I think part of the reason Dr. King's movement was so powerful was they, you know, there were a lot of different movements going on during the civil rights movement. Part of the reason that movement changed the country as deeply as it did was people saw that this body of people were willing to have their blood shed rather than to shed the blood of others. And the Gandhi, you know, Luther, or Dr. King was borrowing from Gandhi there. I mean, Gandhi asked, how can we have the British Empire release control? Others question whether, you know, that only worked because the British were there, or I think those are interesting questions, but we've got the nation we have right now. And I think part of what we need is a visible witness of people being willing to seriously not use violence to pursue an end. Now, as we talked about before, part of where 2020 is different from the 1950s and the 1960s, I wonder to what degree the symbolic imaginary world that they lived in the 50s and 60s and we live in 2020 has changed to the point where it's less understandable for people in 2020 than it was in the 50s and 60s because Christianity is that much less present in the culture. I don't know. I just threw a whole bunch of stuff at you, so you can.
I mean, yeah. There's a lot there. I think the personal ethic of nonviolence is definitely central. One thing, you know, there's that old chestnut that, you know, defining the problem correctly is the lion's share of the effort of solving it. So maybe if we can dig into making sense of the problem statement for our current moment. Like,
Okay.
we know the result that we're trying to avoid, but you allusions to Dr. King and Gandhi are, I think they're the right inspiration in terms of a personal ethic. The challenge I'm seeing is that the situation we're in doesn't line up with sort of the asymmetry at play in the case of Dr. King and in the case of Gandhi, because at those moments in history, it was a movement demanding recompense from the state, or airing its grievance to a state level actor, right? Whereas right now, the thing that's really keeping me up at night is, it actually has nothing to do with Trump or Biden. It has to do with, I'm kept up at night thinking about people that are kept up at night about Trump or Biden. And the fact that I know that there's enough people that are lying awake on both sides of that coin, that whichever one loses, something that turns into a feedback loop of violence. And it's almost immaterial which side starts it for me. Because at this point, we're already so far, we're in Hatfield and McCoy land. Maybe not, I might have my own personal opinions about which political entity I'm more irate with on any given day. I've got my personal background there, but in terms of individuals who are, befriending each other on Facebook, who are refusing to show up to dinner and trimming off their real social connections based on politics, which I think is probably the first, like, that was the warning sign to me in the wake of the 2016 election, was people saying, if you voted for Trump, don't ever talk to me again, right? And I saw that, since I was coming from the left, but there was absolutely this feedback loop of people self-selecting, and this facilitated by social media, into camps that would accept they would entertain no thoughts that anyone in the other camp might have a point about any, like, if you voted for Trump and you said the sky was blue, then God, excuse my almost turned a phrase there. But if you voted for Trump and you say the sky is blue, then damn it, the sky is green, right? That's sort of the attitude that people would have. And that's different than the King and Gandhi thing. And do you know of any historical parallels that might map better to that sort of situation, where it's like, it's a grassroots civil unrest that doesn't actually seem to have a top-down cause other than propagandized?
Yeah. I think when I think about this, there's a few things that I think of. Number one, having a lot of experience in religious communities does give me a sense of how this plays out in individual lives, because in deeply religious communities, people will cut off sons and daughters for not going to church, or going to the wrong church, or marrying a spouse. So that illuminates one aspect of the dynamic. This is different in that we're seeing this scaled out on a political level over far larger numbers of people. That's part of the difference here. Whereas when this happens in a community, in a religious community, there doesn't tend to be, the fracture lines don't travel anywhere near as far. They're very deep, but they're very small. So in terms of the dynamics of that, I certainly have experience with that. I have a lot of the questions involve the, it's helpful to remember that in the 70s, now I'm old enough to remember the 70s somewhat. I was born in 63, so I was a kid in the 70s for the most part, and then a teenager. There were bombings. You go back and you look at, the Weather Underground. There were bombings that were happening in the United States. If you go to Alcatraz, there was a community, an indigenous community that basically took up residence. Nothing was happening on the island of Alcatraz, and they took it over. It was Occupy Alcatraz back in the day. America was deeply divided, but the divisions again were different. And I think both parties, ironically, both parties were less pure and more diverse than they are now. So that's another point of data, that America was more violent in the 70s over the Vietnam War, and then over other issues just in general that were more diffuse. There were bombings that were happening in buildings in New York City and in many places in the country. You had the Symbionese Liberation Army going around, Patty Hearst, and there were many other groups like that. A question, when I hear people anxious about a civil war, there's a good argument made that the American Revolution was a civil war in a sense, because what happened was that before an actual civil war could take place between those who wanted to stay a British colony and those who wanted independence, at a very low level, there needed to be sort of a sorting out. And so people started to relocate. And I see some of that today. People are leaving California and moving. When people leave California, they tend to move to Nevada, Idaho, Texas. And so there is some of that purifying and homogenizing of areas. I don't know. Let's play a scenario out. Let's imagine that Trump loses, because on the left, there's all this anxiety about Republican gun owners. It's difficult at this point for me. I'm not saying it can't happen. It's difficult at this point for me to imagine a bunch of gun-owning Republicans diffused around the nation. I mean, what exactly would they want to occupy in America, and what difference would it make? In many countries around the world, if you want to have a coup d'etat, a fraction of the army takes the presidential palace. I mean, so I'm just kind of running through my imagination of how I've seen these things work out in other places. And I lived in the Dominican Republic for an amount of time, and there weren't any revolutions there, but there were pretty regular revolutions in Haiti, in which missionaries would have to come over the border to the DR to wait for things to settle down. So part of what makes me think we're not going to see what we've seen in a lot of other countries in terms of a mass mobilization and military style movement is the fact that, unlike what I've seen in so many other places in the world, so many Americans have so much to lose via civil unrest. And so where I think you can have kids dressing up in black and bullying people in restaurants and walking through neighborhoods, a lot of the population in the United States is quite accustomed to being left alone and having the lights on and having services provided and getting things their own way. And many of the revolutionaries that I see are really sort of lightweights. These
Hmm.
people who, let's pick on the left a little bit more. These people who say, well, I really am deeply disturbed about the level of white supremacy in America, and you know and I'll say, why don't you give up your job so a person of color can have your job? Well, they're not about to do that. In many ways, even so many radical people, that the change they want, they're not willing to sacrifice anything for it, much less necessarily significantly put their life or freedom at risk. And so I don't know if I share the level of anxiety you do about a total breakdown. I suspect that after the election, I mean, again, not too many years ago, there was a group of people that occupied a national park. We just had a group of people that occupied a certain number of blocks in Seattle. When I look at these groups, I don't, I think, frankly, they are pampered Western kids who, when push comes to shove, really like their cell phones and a lot of the things in life that they have grown accustomed to, and don't even hold a candle to many of the religious people that I have seen who they never took up arms in their causes of social justice or anti-racism, but they did things like sacrificed their own financial futures in order to pursue a nonviolent vision of justice and reconciliation. I don't see that happening in the broader culture hardly at all. And so when it comes to it's very romantic to imagine going out into the street and punching a Nazi, but when the Nazi punches back, well, what then? And there
Hmm.
just aren't that many real Nazis you can find to punch. So
Hmm.
I find that political poll deeply disturbing, but I also wonder the degree to which real Americans are actually going to go out and make the kinds of sacrifices to do things. The guy that was arrested in Seattle, and it wasn't in Seattle, it was in Wisconsin, I think, took a gun out to this thing. This is a kid who made some really stupid now is probably going to sit in jail and get a very difficult lesson on reality. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe convince me that I'm wrong, or maybe I'm helping you sleep better. I don't know. Where do you want to go with this? I'm not
Yeah.
convinced we're at a precipice right now like that, because I don't see some of the other signs.
Okay. It's good for me to hear that psychologically, because just as with any other filter bubble online, you can go down. I heard the term at the beginning of COVID called doom surfing, where you find yourself into the rabbit hole of the world is ending. But there's I have, if I might, hold up my cardboard sign and say the end is near. I'm really worried. I could see a future in which we're not at a precipice in the immediate term, right? But I'm probably, in fact, I'm probably 80-20 against us being at a precipice, but 20% is too damn high, right? And to my thinking, what I don't see is a negative feedback loop in polarization, right? If nothing ever stays the same, everything's a dynamic system in tension. And you've got this trend line of political polarization, dehumanization, willingness to engage in violence going up. Unless at some point it starts going down again, you do reach precipice eventually. Now that the tension going up, but I see it going up in a multiplicative, sort of exponential style fashion, where it's not just going up at a steady rate. Everything is building upon itself. And in the Politico report, they mentioned that, you know, there's evidence to suggest that witnessing or knowing about violence tends to make people more likely to engage in violence, or at least be supportive of it psychologically. I'm probably completely bastardizing the data there, or what the actual claim of the report was. I probably should have kept my mouth shut on that. But I guess the overarching theme is that what everyone thinks the stakes are. There's so many people who think that the stakes of this election are truly existential on both sides. So whoever the losers are not going to take it lightly. Now, so maybe, you know, best case scenario is that you get a couple of weeks of people chanting, of whatever the losing side is. They go out, they do their protest, they chant, they get some energy out of their system, and then, you know, and then the energy is diffused and we keep chugging along. I very much hope that that's the case, but I very much worry that, given what we've seen over the summer, given the continued stress of COVID, given the continued economic insecurity of so many people, like you mentioned, you know, Americans as a whole have too much to lose from civil unrest, right? And if you're lucky enough to still be employed and you pay your electricity bill so that the lights stay on and so the fridge stays full, then that's true. I'm really worried that it doesn't take anywhere approaching 50 or 60 or 70% of the population to decide to ruin it for everybody, right? So I think you're right that the vast majority of people would just as soon be left alone. What I'm concerned is that, you know, all it takes is 5-10% to drastically change. Like, you know, it only takes one shotgun shell through the hull of the boat to start the boat taking on water. Yeah. And I'm worried that there's enough people who are enough on the down and outs and have been driven into really just a blind rage towards a segment of their fellow citizens, that we do run the risk of a positive feedback loop. And so I'm not going to doomsay and say that it's 100%, but it seems to be probable enough that those who see it coming have an obligation to do something to lower the temperature.
Yep. I was, when it was announced that Trump had contracted COVID, I was heartened by Biden's stance when he pulled his negative campaign ads, when he said, you know, my wife and I are, you know, praying for your speedy recovery from COVID. You know, that's leadership. That's striking the right tone. I was happy when, and again, the difficult that when Trump made some, you know, kind comments about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now again, people can, when you're suspicious, anything that the other side says, you see through a lens. But I think part of, and we began this asking the question, what can we do? Panic is contagious. Desperation is contagious. And so I think part of what leaders do are leaders model the behavior that they want at least their followers and hopefully more to emulate. And so I think part of what we need to do is have a degree of calm and and express that, because what
Hmm.
happens when people get anxious? You know, if you, let's imagine that you're a child in a family and something is happening, and kids obviously often get more anxious before their parents. Parents may be feeling the anxiety, but when there are kids around, what do the parents do with the kids? They calm them down.
But yeah.
They put on a calm face. They say everything's going to be okay. You know, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, FDR had to strike a balance. On one hand, the nation felt outraged and wanted to hit back, and FDR understood full well, uh, truth is, the United States Navy has in the Pacific has pretty much been blown to pieces. We were lucky they didn't get the aircraft carriers. Truth be told, there's not a lot we can do to keep the Japanese from sailing those same aircraft carriers out, you know, offshore of San Francisco or LA and bombing the snot out of it. That was the truth. And
Hmm.
the truth was that it was going to take the United States a couple of years to get to the position where they could do something. You know, they had the Doolittle raid, which was a psychological raid. But what FDR did was, you know, in terms of leadership, communicate a number of things that were aspirational a bit. I mean, they promised basically, no, um, we are going to exact a heavy price on Japan for what they have done to us. But, you know, those immortal lines, you know, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And that was extremely savvy, because it could go either way. Because the truth is, once our autonomic nervous system gets rot, it's fear, it's flight or flight. You know, it's both ways. And I think in many ways, as a country, we have to bring down those temperatures. And how do you do that? Well, neither you nor I are at the are elected officials, but I think part of what we ought to communicate is that, well, are these dangerous trends? Absolutely. Okay, how should we respond? Well, we should certainly model what we want to see others do. That is reaching across the aisle, talking to people with whom we have differences, um, sharing. You know, if we catch our rival doing the right thing and praise them, you know, more than criticizing our rival, you know, incessantly criticizing those for all of the negative things that they're doing. You know, catch them doing the right thing, praise them.
Hmm.
And, you know, there's a lot that can be done. And, you know, as a leader of a church and in churches, these are all common things too. You know, I pastor a church which is, you know, struggling in many ways. But if I were to stand up and say, you know, we're done here, well, then it is done. But to say,
Hmm.
no, you know, we've got some challenges, but, you know, and obviously as a Christian, who knows what God can do? And look at these bright signs over here. And, you know, let's take a look at that and let's emphasize that, because unlike a situation in, let's say, again, go back in history, the beginning before the French Revolution. I mean, part of what sparked the French Revolution were hungry mothers marching on Versailles. A lot of people, there are many people who are out of work now, but for the most part, America has managed, and there certainly continues to be hunger here. But again, it is not like the kind of famine that caused the Mother's March on Versailles. Um, and
Hmm.
so I really do think part of America's current crisis is psychological. I saw it
Oh, absolutely.
I saw it during the Obama administration. I mean, people were talking to me about, you know, how horrible Obama was. And I was thinking, okay, but I see people on the left far more extreme than he is. And, you've got Donald Trump, and I can certainly point out a number of things that I don't like about how he's done things, yet at the same time, we're still here. And I, I was having this conversation with a group of people on a listserv, and there are people on the right and people on the left there. And one of the individuals pretty far on the right also is a military chaplain. And people on the left are saying, what if Trump doesn't leave the White House if he's not elected? And, the other person said, members of the armed forces have made, have made oaths, have made vows, promised to do what? To support the president? No, to support the Constitution. And so there's no question that the constitutional mechanisms in America are being tested right now. There's no question about that. And I think in many ways, they haven't been tested like this since the 70s. We might argue that things are different from the 70s. But again, if you go back to the 19th century, talk about corruption in voting, political violence. If you read the history of the 19th century in the United States, it was tremendously corrupt the way campaigns were offered. I mean, and political violence was, outside of even the Civil War, was commonplace. So yes, there are things to be worried about, but I think part of what leadership is to help people pull themselves back from the feedback loop and say, these are some real reasons why. Let's calm down. And again, our leaders need to do this. But not only, I have a cousin who is quite a bit further on the right, listening to him talk too. And I listen to him, and he's got, many people are disturbed at the way things are going, and they're old enough to remember when politicians would talk more about we and us versus them. And, as you mentioned, Hillary's, the greatest threat to the future of America are Republicans. And that's a statement like that should have been called out and said, you know what? That kind of talk puts us at risk, because we have political adversaries.
Instead, it got thunderous applause.
Yes. So again, I think we have to practice what we want to see people do. And I think part of that is for us continuing to remain calm and not give in to fear.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It occurred to me when you were mentioning Biden pulling negative campaign ads, that, how much money is spent every election cycle trying to convince you that someone is evil. Not only wrong, but increasingly the message is not this person has the wrong vision for America. It's this person is actually evil morally. There's a lot of money dumped into that political apparatus. And I think, we can talk about social media, and social media definitely creates an environment where it's very, very easy to get sucked into the echo chamber. But the partisan political apparatus and the campaign strategy of vote for me because the other option is truly the devil incarnate, is that's really, to me, that's the boiler room of this escalation, because you have an environment where, if I would be apathetic, or maybe say I'd want to support a third party, if I'm that type of person, but I am successfully convinced that I have to support, the Democrat or the Republican because the other side is literally the devil incarnate, then when I fill that bubble, I'm performing a psychological operation on myself. I'm agreeing to the argument if I fill out the bubble according to that argument. And in so doing, well, what's the next realization? Well, the realization is that half of the country supports the devil, right? And I think the analogy to religious fractures for apostasy or for dating or marrying someone from a different sector, a different denomination, or even a different religion entirely, I do think that is what's at play right now, because we're not, our political discussions are never about policy anymore. It really is, it feels like engaging in politics has become a theological exercise. Now, I think for some people, it's a bolt-on theology, and for the more secular, it's literally filled the religion module in your brain, if you don't subscribe to one of the longer running wisdom traditions, and that's disastrous, right? I weep for those individuals, right, to have what should be a part of your psychology that is guiding you towards the common good and towards the true, the beautiful, and the good, is instead directing you towards a delusions of grandeur in a holy war in your own country. Now, I think, I don't know what I think. That's but maybe, hopefully there was something in there that you can riff on.
No, I think that's
into
right.
a corner.
I think the world has obviously had many wars fought where there was a religious layer to it. And part of the, it's interesting what happened in the Great American Experiment with respect to the decision that there not be a state church, that it uncoupled these two things. And religion and politics are naturally coupled. I often phrase it that religion is always and politics is now. Then, and as we spoke about with Andrea in our last talk, we talked about the fact that when you have religions that have afterlife components in them, you can, in a sense, relieve some of the pressure that naturally builds up in the now, because God will eventually, figure out what's best to do with Mao and Stalin and your political rivals. You don't have to do it. The classic verse is, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay." And what that verse actually says is, you don't need to be Judge Dredd. You don't need to be judge and executioner all at the same time. And, again, many of these features have been put into our system, where you have police, and then you have a court system, and you have the separation of powers, and that's really vital. And I think you're right in that increasing secularity ironically increases the religious dynamic of politics. I think, as has been said many times before, part of why we're susceptible to this now is that we are in a transitional phase, or at least a disruptive phase, where past dominant religious/political narratives are in flux. And that means that some of these stories, if we look at what a human being is, people implicitly or explicitly sort of run on narratives that shape their expectations and that help to modulate their internal mechanisms in terms of their sense of stasis. I mean, a deep thing that Jordan Peterson offered was, and to whatever degree you want to quibble with him with respect to lobsters, the point of that whole story was we calibrate ourselves based on status hierarchies that are fundamentally created within narratives. Part of what has happened is that these narratives have gotten really dramatically religious political. Now that's been happening for a while. And I've watched that happen in various religious communities. And personally, in terms of where I'm at, in terms of the religious landscape, I always find it abhorrent to see politicians in churches. Not that I don't want politicians to go to church. I don't want politicians behind the pulpit in churches. Now, that's been very common in the Black community, partly because of the particular history of the fact that African Americans had a very difficult time organizing, and the church was one space in which they could organize themselves politically. And so that's part of that story. But politicians belong in pews, not in pulpits. And that separation affords the kind of disintermediating that allows people to relativize the evils or goodness of their political allies and rivals. That's a really helpful function in America that has functioned and right now isn't, as we've seen, for example, the polarization of churches. And so that's part of the reason that I am a pastor in the way I do, and part of the reason that I do not want to see churches that are Republican and churches that are Democratic, which is exactly what we're seeing now. And I think pastors need to pull back from that and lead their own communities in. There's tremendous pressure on pastors right now from both sides to get into this game. It's pressure from their congregations and pressure among clergy. It's not uncommon for me to see, and again, I think social media amplifies this, for me to see pastors in one place or another basically say, in the past, yada, 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 but now it is our duty from God to make sure that either Trump gets elected or Trump doesn't get elected. There's not a big, there's not a religion behind Joe Biden's the man. It's like Trump or no Trump. But
oh yeah, absolutely.
But no, and so I very much agree from what we've seen. But again, to get back between I and we, part of me is, okay, what do I do on social media? What do I do on YouTube? What do I do in conversations with pastors? I think it's pulling people back. And in a religious space, I have more tools to do that because finally God is in charge, and also finally God is the judge. And so I can leverage those tools. They're to a degree in the public sphere, but not as strongly.
Yeah, so two things that you just made me think about. One is just an idea. Tell me if you think this has legs or not. But the observation that you've got, your Republican churches and your Democratic churches more and more every day is not surprising, but I hadn't really thought about it. Do you think there would be anything to a congregational ambassador program to just to this extent of, hey, you should not be thinking about people who vote differently as cartoon devils or as, you know, real demons. Are you aware of any actual efforts underway, or do you think an effort of the style of, you know, a similar to like a exchange program for, you know, 1 or 2 Sundays in a row, guest speaking and just being like, hey, I know you guys lean this way politically. I'm from this congregation a couple blocks down the road that leans this way politically. Just want to say we're still neighbors, or like, you know, something along those lines. So that the one thing is, you know, is that just too campy and cheesy to ever work, or would it have legs? And the other thing, to the point of, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole because we spent a long time on it last time. But we did talk about sort of the justice being meted out by God in the afterlife serves a function. But it seems to me that that's also a double-edged sword, right? Because it can engender a sense of sort of relinquishing of duty to your fellow human beings, to say, oh, okay, well, you know, Hitler will get punished in the afterlife, so I don't need to fight him myself. And I am worried. I don't know if you've seen anything to this effect, but I have seen going around more and more I want to say propaganda, but propaganda isn't exactly the right term. I want something more specific, but more and more writing and thought from, I don't have a ton of connections to the like sort of deeply religious community, but I have some, and I'm seeing more that is focusing on revelations and actually making the claim that we are at the outset of biblical end times, right? And with it typically comes the admonition, the like, you don't need to do anything, just stay at home and kneel at your bed and pray, and you will be saved. And it seems to me that that level of inaction, that is surrendering the game to the extremists who want to fight each other, right? Those of goodwill, you know, to go back to where we started a little bit with Dr. King, you know, we're not there. The thing that a nonviolent movement right now needs to do is, you're not making demands of the state. You're making demands of, you're the person that gets in between two people swinging blows at each other at the bar and puts your hands out, right? So now that's a terrifying call to action, right? To ask someone to do that. But I think it might be the style of courage and ethics that we need to inspire in one another, is to find the people who are willing to walk into the crossfire, and such that when, as they bleed, because no one's got two fighting camps, when the news comes out that there is an altercation, it's going to make the relative moderates on each camp more angry at the other ones, and increase, it's the positive feedback loop that increases the chances that they get radicalized. When a true civilian is caught in the crossfire, when that news gets out, I think that has the opposing effect. It makes you angry at the conflict itself. You become Mercutio, a plague on both of your houses. You're fighting over ultimately nothing. We're in the richest country in the history of the world. Like, what the hell is your problem? And innocents are getting in the crossfire. So to the extent that we can follow in the footsteps of Dr. King, or follow in the footsteps of Gandhi, it's willingly marching yourself into the crossfire to show that you're not willing to engage in the violence on either side and model that for other people.
I think you're right. There are certainly biblical material that can be used in one way or another, and I see that happen. End times speculation is a near constant thing. 1980, Countdown to Armageddon. I can trip through titles that sold books pretty much all the way from the 70s until now. And because, I'm close enough to communities like that, and that's pretty much a constant. In terms of the, we began by asking the question, what can we? And over this weekend, there were 2 drive-by shootings in Sacramento. And in one of them, a 9-year-old girl was killed. Other members of her family are currently in the hospital. And another one, a couple of other innocent people were hurt. I was struck in reading the news of this that whereas when there's police violence done in another city completely across the country, people show up in the streets to turn everything upside down. But when there's these drive-by shootings here in Sacramento, there was a prayer request at church, but there's no outrage. Well, why? That's an interesting question to ask. We human beings, again, getting back to this narrative thing, obviously with George Floyd, what was triggered was a narrative, but that narrative did not happen in a vacuum. There was an accident on the corner here, and there are many accidents on this corner here by my church, and you hear the screeching of tires, the slam, and then I usually go out when I hear that, see, okay, is anybody injured? Well, there was a white woman and a black woman who were in the accident, and the white woman apparently was at fault, I don't know, and the black woman went after her, used a number of racial slurs. She was larger than the white woman, and I basically went in and got between them because, the black woman's daughter was injured. Her grandson was in the car. When this happens, all of this stuff in the media imaginary and in their personal pasts flood in. And it creates a story, and people act within those stories. So when we ask the question, okay, what should I do? Well, I think part of what we have to do is continue to help reshape the story for our neighbors. We have to steward the story for ourselves. And we need to in the story of getting between two people versus passivity, action itself, one might argue that, okay, when I got between those two women, I'm a man, they're both women, I'm a pretty big guy. In some ways, just my size and my presence cooled the situation because neither of those women knew me. Was I a threat of violence? And in many ways, that's often what curtails violence, is there's another threat of violence. And just by virtue of who I am and my size, the possibility of violence, they could quickly assess that neither of them would win any fight against me. And so no matter how angry one might be at the other, she wasn't going to get through me to get at the other person. And so my presence there stopped the violence. I regularly have it in dealing with homeless people that certain homeless people that get upset or even violent, they won't get violent towards me. They might get violence towards a smaller man or a woman. So that's a piece of this equation too. And so another piece of this equation continues to have to be, to what degree or another is the authority of the government seen as, at least in some ways, a neutral party? And it's that, it's that element of the current crisis that is difficult, because as the polarization, what really gets undercut is the imagination of the neutrality and the authority of the government to, at least to one degree or another, maintain justice, which is a degree of balance. So I think, all of this being said, we have to be very careful about thinking about action and inaction with respect to these dynamics. So I could have stayed out of that scene and continued to watch the one woman grabbed the other woman. She threw her up in front of the car. She starts spitting into her face. I didn't know if there was going to be a headbutt or fists start to fly at that point. So at that point, I just decided to act, which I did. And she backed off. A lot of yelling, but I could get between them and they could calm down and the police could come. And then it was a white cop. Then she starts on at the cop. The cop had less patience than I had and started talking, and you could just see this thing escalate. So in individual instances, it's really important to be a presence of de-escalation. But again, when we get into the a lot of what we're dealing with is messaging, testimony, witness, posture, presenting narratives, presenting calm. And when we get into, okay, what can we do? I think it's a lot of, well, when I'm on social media or when I'm on a listserv, someone's heightening it, bring it down. Are they evil? They might be doing evil things. In Christian talk, we battle not against flesh and blood. They might be being possessed by things, or there are other principalities and powers working through them. But in a Pauline sense, people are themselves image bearers of God. And so we pull that down. So again, I think a lot of this is modeling, training the people around us. And when you get further into the story, as you did, okay, what kinds of formation do you need to be willing to absorb personal injury up to, and you're talking about walking into the line of fire, you're talking about the potential of death. What kind of story do you need to be immersed in where you will give your life, not against an enemy? That's an easier thing to convince people to do. But you will give your life for the maintenance of peace, and maybe futilely so. And again, even though, I agree that in many ways we're looking at a different take from, let's say, what you saw in Dr. King's rally. The in terms of Christianity, there are a lot of resources because the founder of the religion, in a sense, does that. Because Jesus is not appealing to the Romans, and Jesus is not appealing to the religious authorities of his day. Jesus, in a sense, appears to die for no cause, and on the cross he cries out to God, that is his appeal. So again, I think Christians need to be better Christians, and so people who have a degree of authority and standing, like myself, within our communities, and these communities are broadly spread out, I think Christian leaders have to lead in these ways to lower the tensions, lower the rhetoric. And again, I think part of why we're in this mess is both parties have gotten to the point where they imagine the only way we can win is to keep pressing the fear buttons in the people, keep pressing the evil buttons, and keep ramping this up. And I remember John McCain at a rally. It was a very famous thing when a woman got up and starts just really berating Barack Obama. And John McCain basically said, stop. He is an honorable man. We are having an election. You know, our country needs a lot more of that. And the part of the problem is that both parties have gotten into the habit of going to this place in order to scare people into the polls. And just it has risen, and I agree with you. We've got to bring that temperature down. And I think the only way we do it, I think we model it and we talk it, and we're willing to put our lives where our mouths are.
Yeah. Well, I think that's good enough for me, at least in the short term. Maybe if I convince you to lose some sleep, or if October delivers us another couple weeks of craziness, we can sync up again.
Well, the question I have for you is, what do you imagine to be done more than what is being done? Because when you're talking more of the we,
you know,
where do I and we connect?
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm a software engineer of the, you know, Silicon Valley. I've never lived in Silicon Valley, but I do find myself, you know, having that mindset that's like, oh, here's a problem. Like, how can I decompose it and do something beyond the individual? Like, what's the relation or a nonprofit or something like that, right? And you know, there's a whole host of ideas, right? For example, I've spent several months now volunteering for Unity 2020, which, you know, someone would call the quixotic plan for a bipartisan ticket. Now, I should preface this, you know, I'm not a mouthpiece for the organization. I can only speak to my personal motivations for, you know, what led me to volunteer a lot of time there. And my motivation was very much in addressing this problem, because if you go to that Politico report, they say, you know, it's a percentage of people who think political violence is justified for their team, which means, you know, they're only going to be antagonists if they lose, right? But if you could have a bipartisan ticket that would agree to consult each other in the Oval Office, if you had someone from both the red team and the blue team, well, then you significantly lower the insanity of the losing team on November 4th, when the election results are announced, because everybody feels, even if they didn't get exactly what they wanted, they know that the literal devil isn't in the Oval Office, whoever the literal devil is for them. Now, Unity has, you know, we're getting to the point where, you know, ballots are printed. So, you know, there was an announcement a week or so ago that Unity was, you know, suspending the quixotic, you know, partnership ticket. But, you know, there's a lot of great people in the movement that see the same sort of dangers and are still very motivated to do things. And you know, people are working on plans for, like, okay, just because our first proposed solution isn't, it might not be a silver bullet, what's the next things to do. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what's my next project in line with that. And once again, to reiterate, the ideas I'm about to spitball are things that I believe in strongly, and in terms of the way I've thought them through. So absolutely not I'm just a volunteer, right? I'm not a mouthpiece for what the greater movement will wind up becoming on the other end of the caterpillar to butterfly transformation. But in thinking about the psychological effect of signing on to the evil of the other side by filling if you are sufficiently afraid that you fill in the bubble, by filling in that bubble, that is, you're sealing and cementing that narrative in your brain that the other side is every bit as evil as your side is telling you they are. And by extension, that means I think every time someone fills in a ballot for that reason, with that as their motivation, we are increasing the temperature, which is why I see election time as so critical. So there's what I would love to see is a mechanism whereby, let's say, for the sake of argument, electorally, let's say we're in the same state, you and I, and let's say I'm a Biden voter, but I'm not an enthusiastic one, and you're a Trump voter and not an enthusiastic one, but we're both getting propagandized 24/7 that this is existential and we can't let the other person win. If you and I are sufficiently fearful that would be motivating, but we don't want to be motivated in that way, like if we're on the cusp, if there was a mechanism whereby we could build enough trust before we cast our ballot and say, you know what, let's defect together. We're going to count. Our fear motivated votes are going to cancel each other out. Let's recognize that and develop enough of a rapport and enough trust across the aisle as individuals that we're going to refuse to cast a fear motivated vote for the president. And that's the extent of the agreement. If I want a green or libertarian or a write-in, I might do that. If you want a different, if you want a libertarian, I want a green, or if you want a libertarian and I just don't care, I want to free myself psychologically from making that fear motivated vote, and I just want to vote down ballot, the vote we do cast is still up to us and our conscience, right? It's just that if we can take the first step in advance of casting the ballot and build that conduit of trust, I think that pays dividends for our own psychology. And if we can, if we could proactively do that, then all of those pairwise of connections across the country of two people that decided to take a leap of faith and trust each other, and refuse to be motivated by fear together, those pairs of people can become conduits within their communities. They can introduce their friends to each other, and they can start to build real bridges in, December and January and beyond the election. It sets the stage. So that's one example of an activity that could be taken, right? And that's a hell of an ask right now, right? Because trust is slim pickings, especially across the partisan divide.
Yep.
So that's my aspiration for something that can happen. But I'm not the me of the good. it could be as simple as, you know, hey, let's a class and someone, and you're going to jot down they talk about, and the only purpose is so the testimonial truly believe, and say, hey, this is what I thought this person believed before I had it. When all I knew was that they were going to vote for Trump, this is what I thought that they believed. And then at the other side of a half-hour phone call, you fill out a survey and say, oh, this is what they actually believe. I still disagree with all of it, but at least I understand them better. So I'm not interacting with a caricature of them anymore. I'm interacting with something real.
And all of this in some ways requires that people, I mean, part of what's so challenging about it is that in order for people to participate in it, they've already got to one degree or another recognized the problem. And so they're motivated to participate in something that gets them further towards that. And so I very much like a lot of the ideas about that, but I think in many ways, the question is, how do we get people off the go juice in terms of this political polarization, and say, and again, I think a lot of those is, okay, let's lower the temperature, and I'd love to see, I mean, there are political ways to do this. I'd love to see political campaigning narrowed to certain time frames. I think having, this constant political campaign, which is sort of what we have now, we're always, but I think, again, it comes down to each of us. Let's find some solutions to broaden our connections with people who are on the opposite side of a political divide. Let's do those kinds of things intentionally. Let's do it in our church space. Let's do it in our family space. Let's do it in our neighborhoods. Let's have a higher resolution view of one another beyond just their political spectrum perspective. Maybe have an understanding of why they have the political perspectives that they have. What are some of the interests that they're concerned about that perhaps I never thought of? So at least I may disagree with them, but I can say, I can understand why they're making the vote that they're making. I understand the world through their eyes. And even if I lose this election and I win, and they win, I can live with that. And especially if I have a sense that they care about me and I care about them. And so whatever the government does with the power that it has, I will not only be interested in my political side, but I'll also be interested in the well-being of my political rivals.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Party before country, country before party. Sorry, I got it inverted. I'm sufficiently brainwashed, I guess, still.
So, well, maybe, we've got a month or so. It's coming up on a month before the election. We'll see. Hopefully, things will, whatever happens, I hope that the election is clear so that there can't be too much hemming and hawing. And then hopefully whatever side loses concedes and vows to fight another day, but holds that off until that
metaphorically.
Yeah. So
I'll join you in that hope. Hey, Paul, thank you so much for the time. This was a lot more somber than last time, but it was still lively and fun.
Well, I don't see a lot of reason to cheer in the news, but I think there are still reasons, and I think we ought to hold on to hope.
Yeah. Works for me.
Okay, Ryan. It was good talking to you.
Likewise.
Okay.
Talk soon. Stay healthy, buddy.
All right. You too. Bye-bye.